Dorothy Sims walked into the Bells Mill boarding house on a Tuesday morning with a folded piece of paper in her hand and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Eliza Harper was behind the front desk, tallying the week's ledger, when the older woman set that paper down without a word, just placed it flat on the counter and smoothed it with one palm like she was ironing a shirt. It was an eviction notice. "You have 30 days, Dorothy said. "The building's being sold. My brother's buying it. I'm sure you understand." Eliza looked up slowly. "Your brother?" "That's right. The same brother who came in here 6 weeks ago asking to borrow $40, and I gave it to him from my own pocket?" Dorothy smiled again. Same smile. "Business is business, dear." The room went quiet. Two of the boarders, old Mr. Fenwick and a young traveling salesman named Cole, both stopped what they were doing and stared. Nobody said a word. Dorothy picked up her gloves from the counter, pulled them on one finger at a time, and walked out the door like she hadn't just burned the floor out from under a woman who had nothing left to lose. If that made your blood run hot, you're not alone. Stay with us, because this story is just getting started. If you're watching from your city or your country, drop it in the comments below. It means the world to us to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and hit that like button so you don't miss a single chapter of what happens next. Teammates, Bells Mill was not a town that forgave people for being strangers. It sat along the eastern edge of a river nobody had bothered to name properly, wedged between a ridge of low hills and a stretch of flat farmland that turned to mud every spring and cracked like old pottery every August. The mill itself, a hulking 3-story structure of weathered pine and rusted iron fittings, had been the town's reason for existing for nearly 2 decades, and the town had shaped itself around that mill the way skin shapes itself around bone. Everything else came second: the general store, the livery, the doctor's office with its sagging porch step that everyone complained about and nobody fixed, and the boarding house, which sat on the far end of Merchant Street and had been, until recently, one of the few places in Bells Mill where a person could get a clean bed and a hot meal without someone asking too many questions about where they came from. Eliza Harper had arrived in Bells Mill on the 3rd of October, 2 years prior, with a worn leather travel bag, $43 and a handkerchief tucked into her boot, and a letter from a man named Gerald Pence, promising her steady work managing accounts for the mill. She had read that letter so many times the folds had gone soft. She had memorized it. She had staked everything on it. Gerald Pence died 11 days before she arrived. His widow, a brittle woman named Constance who wore black like it was a weapon, met Eliza at the door of the mill office and told her the position no longer existed. She didn't invite Eliza inside. She didn't offer her a glass of water. She looked at Eliza's bag, at her road-worn coat, at the careful way she was holding herself together, and she said, "I'm sorry for your inconvenience," and closed the door. Eliza stood on that porch for a long moment. Then she walked to the boarding house, asked the owner, a heavy-set man named Carl Briggs, if he had any work, and spent the next 8 months washing linens and cooking breakfast before Carl's knees gave out entirely, and he asked if she wanted to run the place herself in exchange for a cut of the income. She said yes before he finished the sentence. That was how Eliza Harper came to be managing the Bells Mill boarding house. Not because anyone had given her a chance, because she had stayed when every reasonable person would have left. And she had made something out of it. Not comfort, exactly. The house had 6 rooms, 2 of which leaked when it rained, and the kitchen stove ran hot on one side and cold on the other, and she had spent the better part of her first winter arguing with suppliers about credit terms. But it was hers, in the way that something can be yours without your name being on the deed. She knew which stair creaked. She knew which boarder needed the curtains left open in the morning and which one needed the room dark until noon. She knew the rhythm of the place, and the place knew her, and that was something. Then Dorothy Sims walked in with her folded paper and her smoothing palm, and 30 days became the only number Eliza could think about. She stood at the front desk for a long time after Dorothy left, staring at the notice without reading it again. She already knew what it said. She'd understood the situation the moment she saw Dorothy's expression, that particular look that people in small towns sometimes get when they believe they hold something over someone who has nothing to counter with. Mr. Fenwick cleared his throat from his chair by the window. He was 71, a retired surveyor with a bad hip and an excellent memory. "You all right, Eliza?" "Fine," she said, which was not true, but it was the kind of not true that a person says when they're still working out what the truth is. Cole, the traveling salesman, folded his newspaper and set it on the side table. He was 25, broad-shouldered, easily flustered. "Can she do that? Just sell the building?" "She can do whatever she wants," Eliza said. "It's her building." "But you've been running it for her building, Cole." He went quiet. Eliza folded the notice in half and slid it under the desk and went back to her ledger. But the numbers wouldn't settle. They kept sliding around, refusing to stack up the way they should, and she realized after several minutes that her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, she told herself, but from something more complicated than fear, something that lived underneath fear and had no clean name. She had been here before, not in Bell's Mill, but in this particular situation. The situation of having built something carefully and watching someone else decide they were entitled to it. She closed the ledger. She needed to think, and she couldn't think in the boarding house with Fenwick's sympathetic eyes and Cole's nervous newspaper folding. So she put on her coat and walked out. The street was cold. November had settled into Bell's Mill the way it always did, quietly and without ceremony, just a gradual tightening of the air until you realized one morning that summer had become a memory and winter intended to stay. She walked without a clear direction, her breath making small clouds, her boots loud on the frozen ground. She hadn't gone half a block before she heard the mill whistle blow, the long, flat tone that meant the afternoon shift was ending. And almost immediately after, she heard his voice. "You're walking without your coat buttoned." She looked up. Caleb Whitmore was standing outside the mill gate, his jacket pushed back from his forearms despite the cold, a clipboard in one hand and a pencil tucked behind his ear. He had that look he always had at the end of a shift, focused, slightly tired, already calculating the next thing that needed doing. He wasn't particularly tall, wasn't the kind of man who filled a room by standing in it, but there was something solid about him, the way a well-made piece of furniture is solid, not ornamental, just built to hold. He noticed things. That was the thing about Caleb. He noticed things without making a production of it. "I'm aware my coat is unbuttoned," Eliza said. "Cold out." "I'm aware of that too." He looked at her for a moment. Not a searching look exactly, more like the look of someone taking a reading. Then he tucked his clipboard under his arm. "What happened?" "Nothing." "Eliza." She exhaled. "Dorothy Sims came by. Apparently her brother is buying the boarding house and I have 30 days to clear out." He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone who didn't have anything to say, more like the silence of someone who had too many things to say and was choosing carefully. "Her brother," he finally said. "Franklin Sims, you know him?" "I know of him." Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. "He was involved in some dealings with the old Perkins property. Land sale that didn't end the way the Perkins family expected." "What does that mean?" "It means he's done this kind of thing before." He looked at the mill gate, then back at her. "You have 30 days. That's enough time to look at the situation carefully." "Caleb, it's a sale. What is there to look at?" "Documents, transfer records, any arrangement you might have with Carl Briggs, even informal ones." He paused. "You don't know how this sale was structured. You don't know what Franklin Sims actually paid for, legally speaking. There may be more to contest than you think." She stared at him. "How do you know about things like that?" "I've been running this mill for 3 years," he said simply. "People try to take things that aren't quite theirs to take. You learn to read the paperwork." She looked at him for a long moment. She had known Caleb Whitmore for nearly 2 years. He had been walking her home on Wednesday nights for most of that time. Ever since the evening, a drunk miner had followed her from the general store, and Caleb had stepped in without being asked. After that, it had become a habit, and habits in a small town became their own kind of institution. She had never quite been able to read him, whether his consistency was something personal or simply the expression of a man who took obligation seriously, the way he took everything seriously. "Why do you always know the right thing to say?" she asked, and she hadn't meant it to come out the way it did. Not sharp, not exactly, but with an edge she couldn't quite control. He blinked. "I don't." "But you always show up And you always have an answer, and you always... She stopped herself. This was not what she'd come outside to talk about. This was the other thing, the thing that lived underneath the boarding house situation, and she didn't have room for it right now. Never mind. I need to think. All right. I'm walking. I know. He fell into step beside her. She stopped. I didn't ask you to walk with me. No, he agreed. You didn't. She stared at him. He looked back at her with that steady, unhurried expression, and something in her chest did the thing it sometimes did around him, a kind of tightening or loosening. She could never decide which, and she turned and kept walking, and he kept pace beside her, and neither of them said anything for half a block. Then she said, I need to find Carl Briggs. He's usually at the Lantern by 4 o'clock. Do you know everything about everyone in this town? No, Caleb said, but I know Carl drinks at the Lantern. The Lantern was Bell's Mill's single saloon, a low-ceilinged establishment that smelled permanently of sawdust and something fermented, with a long bar down one side and 4 round tables in the middle and a back room that everyone pretended didn't exist. Carl Briggs was indeed at the bar, on a stool, with a glass in front of him and the specific posture of a man who had been sitting there a while. He was 62 years old, heavy-set in the way of men who had been strong in their youth and had let that strength soften around the edges, with a white beard and pale blue eyes that went sharp when he noticed Eliza coming through the door. Eliza? His voice was cautious. Carl. She sat down on the stool beside him. Caleb took up a position behind her left shoulder, not in an aggressive way, just there. Carl glanced at him and then back at her. I imagine you heard about the sale, Carl said. Dorothy Sims came by this morning. He winced. I was going to tell you myself. It happened faster than I expected, and I'm not here to make you feel bad, Carl. She kept her voice even. I need to understand the situation. What exactly did you sell? He wrapped both hands around his glass. The building, and the land it sits on. And the business? He hesitated. That hesitation was information. There's some complexity there. What kind of complexity? Franklin made an offer. I was in no position to... My knees are gone, Eliza, and the doctor says I've got... He stopped. I needed the money. He made an offer, and I took it. Carl. She kept her voice gentle but pressed it. Did you sell him the business, or just the building? He rubbed the back of his neck. The sale was for the property, the building, and the land. And the business accounts? The border agreements? The operating arrangement we had? That was verbal, he said quietly. I know it was verbal. I'm asking if the sale documents address it. He looked at his glass. I don't know that they do. Eliza felt something shift, not quite hope, but its predecessor. A possibility, narrow and not yet solid, but present. She glanced back at Caleb. He gave a very small nod, barely perceptible. I need to see those documents, Carl. Franklin won't like that. I'm not asking Franklin. I'm asking you. You were the seller. You have a copy. Another hesitation. Then the old man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded set of papers, 3 sheets, dense with writing, and set them on the bar. Eliza unfolded them carefully. Caleb leaned in beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth off his jacket, and they both read. The language was standard property transfer. Building, land parcel, fixtures permanently affixed. It was thorough in the ways that a transfer written by someone trying to be thorough was thorough. But it was silent on several points. The border agreements, Eliza said. There's nothing here about the existing tenants or the operating arrangements. No, Caleb said quietly. And there's nothing here about the business accounts, the ledgers. No, she looked at Carl. Who wrote this document? Franklin brought his own man. Of course he did. Carl, I want you to understand something. You may have sold the building, but the business, the actual operating business, the accounts, the agreements with the borders, the arrangements for food and services, those aren't fixtures. Those weren't included here, which means there may be a question about what Franklin Sims actually bought. Carl stared at her. You're saying he doesn't own the business. I'm saying it's not in this document. She refolded the papers and handed them back. I'm going to need to talk to someone who knows property law in this county. Nearest lawyer's in Hadley, Carl said. Then I'll write to Hadley tonight. She stood up. Carl caught her arm, gently, the way an old man catches someone's arm when he wants to express something he can't quite say directly. I'm sorry, girl. I should have handled it better. She looked at him for a moment. There was genuine regret in his face, and she had known him long enough to recognize when it was real. Write me out a statement, she said about our arrangement. What we agreed to, when we agreed to it, what the terms were. Everything you remember. Can you do that? He nodded slowly. I can do that. Good. She buttoned her coat, all the way up, which she noticed Caleb clocked without comment, and walked out. They stood on the street outside the lantern. The afternoon had gone gray, the sky the color of unpolished iron, and the cold had teeth now. You handled that well, Caleb said. I didn't handle anything. I just asked questions. Asking the right questions is most of it. She was quiet for a moment, turning over what she'd found, the gap in the documents, the possibility, the slender thread of legal ambiguity that might or might not hold weight. It wasn't much, but it was something to work with, and Eliza Harper had built her entire tenure in Bell's Mill out of working with things that weren't much. The Sims family, she said. Tell me about Franklin. Caleb shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. Franklin Sims is about 50. Runs a land acquisition operation out of Hadley, mostly. He comes into Bell's Mill 3 or 4 times a year. Caleb paused, choosing. He's the kind of man who's very good at finding things that other people need and using that need as leverage. He's not openly dishonest. He operates within the edges of things. And Dorothy? His sister. She handles the social side of his dealings, the face-to-face. She's... Another pause. She's very good at making things seem inevitable. She was, Eliza said flatly, until today. Caleb looked at her sideways. There was something in his expression she couldn't fully interpret, something that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. Not amusement exactly, more like recognition. What? She said. Nothing. He shook his head. What do you need? She thought about it. I need time. I need access to the county records. And I need Franklin Sims to not know I'm looking into this before I've had a chance to understand what I'm dealing with. Franklin will hear something soon, Caleb said. Probably already has. Dorothy doesn't move without telling him. How long do I have before he does something? Caleb thought. 3 days? Maybe 4? He'll want to look magnanimous first, give you the courtesy of the notice, play the role of the reasonable man. That's how he operates. Then he'll start applying pressure. 3 days, she repeated. Maybe 4. She nodded. 3 days was not much. But it was more than nothing, which was what she'd had at 10 o'clock this morning. She started walking. Caleb fell into step beside her again. You don't have to walk with me, she said. I know. I'm not going home. I'm going to the records office before it closes. I know where the records office is. She glanced at him. You're not going to ask me to slow down or think about this more carefully or... No. You're just going to walk. Yes. She stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and turned to look at him fully. He stopped too, waiting, that steady, unhurried expression firmly in place. Why do you do that? She asked. Why do you just show up every Wednesday? And now this? Why don't you ever explain yourself? The question landed between them and sat there. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. The gray sky pressed down. Somewhere behind them, a door banged in the wind. Because explaining myself doesn't make the thing I'm doing more or less true, he said finally. I'm here because I want to be here. That's the whole of it. She stared at him. Gee, something in that answer, its simplicity, its refusal to dress itself up, did something to the complicated internal architecture she'd been maintaining since Dorothy Sims had walked in with her folded paper in her smooth palm, and for just a moment she felt the weight of the whole situation settle differently, not lighter but more distributed, as if something was helping her carry it. She turned and kept walking. The records office closed at 5, and they had 40 minutes. The clerk, a thin young man named Harold, who disapproved of almost everything on principle, let them in with visible reluctance and went back to his desk and made a point of shuffling papers loudly. Eliza found the property transfer filings for the last 3 years and started reading. Caleb stood beside her and read over her shoulder and occasionally pointed to something without comment. His instincts about documents were sharp, sharper than she'd expected from a mill operator, and twice he flagged something she'd nearly skipped over. "Here," he said, pointing to a transfer from 14 months ago. "Perkins' property. You see the structure?" She looked. He bought the land, but not the water rights. And then he came back 6 months later and bought the water rights separately, for twice what the original sale agreement implied they were worth. She looked up at him. He squeezed them. He waited until they needed something, and then he came back and charged them for it. She thought about that, about Franklin Sims's pattern, about the way the boarding house sale documents were silent on the business arrangements, the accounts, the operating agreements, about the gap. "He's planning to come back," she said slowly. "He'll buy the building first. Then when I'm desperate, when I have no legal ground to stand on and no time left, he'll come back and offer me some arrangement for the business side. Some agreement that puts me entirely in his pocket." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "That would be consistent with how he's worked before. He doesn't want to run me out. He wants to own me." The words sat in the air. Harold shuffled his papers very loudly. "Then we make sure he can't," Caleb said. "We." She noticed that. She almost said something about it, but the records were still spread out in front of her, and Harold was making the kind of noises that meant he was close to ending the visit, and there wasn't time. She took careful notes. Every relevant transfer, every pattern she could find, every piece of the structure of Franklin Sims's operation that showed itself in the public record. Her handwriting was small and precise, and she filled both sides of 3 sheets of paper before Harold finally put his coat on and cleared his throat in the specific way that meant he was standing directly behind them. "We're done," Eliza said, without turning around. "Thank you, Harold." Harold did not respond, but she heard him relax slightly. Outside the records office, the street was nearly dark. The cold had gotten serious while they were inside. That particular evening cold of early November that makes everything feel final. "I need to write that letter to Hadley tonight," Eliza said. "There's a lawyer there named Marsh, Edmund Marsh. He's handled property disputes in this county before. Caleb considered. "He's expensive, but he's careful, and he doesn't make promises he can't keep." "How do you know him?" "Mill business? 3 years ago we had a boundary dispute with the Alderman farm." He looked at her steadily. "I can introduce you, if that would help." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamplight from the records office window was doing something to the angles of his face, making him look more tired than usual, and she realized that he'd come from the end of a full shift and had been walking around this town with her for 2 hours without once suggesting they stop or slow down or that this wasn't his problem. "Caleb," she said carefully, "you don't have to be involved in this. I know. This is my situation. You have your own. You're running the mill, and you have enough." "Eliza." His voice was quiet, but it stopped her. "I'm aware that I don't have to be involved. I'm aware that this isn't my situation. I'm choosing to help. Those are different things." She opened her mouth, closed it. "Let me write to Marsh tonight," he said. "I know what to say that will get him to take it seriously. You write out everything you found today. Every document, every note, Carl's statement when he has it, all of it. We put together a complete picture and we send it to Marsh tomorrow morning." She thought about pushing back. She was aware that she had a habit, built over years, of not letting people help her. Not because she didn't want help, but because help so often came with a cost she couldn't predict. But she looked at Caleb's face in the November lamplight, and she thought about the 2 years of Wednesday nights, the way he never asked anything in return, the way he'd stepped in with the miner without being asked, and then never once made her feel she owed him for it. And she thought, this one is different. "All right," she said. He nodded once, the way he nodded when he'd noted something and filed it away. They walked back toward Merchant Street. The town was quiet around them. The last of the day's business done, most people inside with their lamps lit against the dark. A dog barked somewhere, then stopped. "Can I ask you something?" Eliza said. "Yes." "The first time you walked me home, after the miner that night, I never said thank you." "You did, actually, 3 days later. Outside the general store. She blinked. You remember that. I remember most things, he said simply. She walked a few steps in silence. Then, did you keep walking me home because you thought I needed protecting? Or, no. I didn't finish. I kept walking you home because I wanted to, he said. The minor was the first time. After that, it was something I wanted to do. A pause. I thought it was clear. She looked at him. It wasn't, actually. He absorbed that without expression. All right. Caleb, what does that mean? That you wanted to? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, carefully. It means that your Wednesday is the part of my week I don't have to think hard about. Everything else requires calculations, managing people, watching numbers, making sure nothing breaks. With you, it's... He stopped. It's not like that. She felt the warmth of that land somewhere around her collarbone and spread upward. She looked straight ahead at the dark street and kept walking. That's the most I've ever heard you say, she managed. Don't get used to it. She laughed. Genuinely, briefly, the first real laugh of the day. He didn't laugh with her, but she caught in her peripheral vision the corner of his mouth doing something. They reached the boarding house. She stopped at the door. I'll have everything written out by morning, she said. Carl's statement, the notes from today, all of it. I'll write to Marsh tonight and have it sent first thing. And then? And then we wait to see what Franklin Sims does next, Caleb said. He's going to make a move, probably within the week once he understands we're not just accepting the 30 days. And when he does? Then we're ready. She looked at him standing in the cold, jacket still pushed back from his forearms like the temperature was a minor inconvenience, and she thought about what he'd said, that her Wednesday was the part of his week he didn't have to think hard about. And she thought, something is happening here that is bigger than the boarding house, and I am not ready for it, and I don't have time for it right now, but it's happening anyway. Good night, Caleb, she said. Good night. She went inside. The house was warm and smelled like the supper she'd left simmering, and Mr. Fenwick was asleep in his chair by the window, and everything was exactly as she'd left it. She sat down at the small desk in the back room and opened her notebook and started writing. The pages filled. Dorothy's visit, the documents at the lantern, the records office, the pattern she'd seen in the Perkins transfer, every detail she could pull from the day's hours, arranged in the careful order that her mind naturally produced. She wrote until past midnight. Then she looked at what she had. It was a beginning, not a solution, not yet, and maybe not ever. She'd been in enough uncertain situations to know that beginnings didn't guarantee endings. But it was organized, and it was detailed, and it pointed to something real. She thought about Franklin Sims deciding she would roll over in 30 days. She thought about Dorothy smoothing that notice on her counter. She thought about Caleb saying, without ceremony, that her Wednesday was the part of his week he didn't have to think hard about. She closed her notebook. Tomorrow was going to require everything she had. She was going to be ready. The letter to Edmund Marsh went out on the first morning post, and Eliza spent the rest of that day running the boarding house like nothing had changed, making breakfast, collecting rent from Cole, patching the leak in room 4 with a strip of tar paper she'd been saving since September. Because the worst thing she could do right now was let Franklin Sims know she was moving. She'd learned that much about men like him. They counted on the reaction. The panic, the scrambling, the visible distress that told them they had leverage. The moment you showed them what they'd hit, they hit it again. So she smiled at Dorothy Sims when Dorothy passed the boarding house on her morning walk. She smiled the same way Dorothy had smiled at her, pleasant, surface level, containing nothing. Dorothy's step faltered almost imperceptibly. Good, Eliza thought. Let her wonder. By Wednesday, 3 days after the eviction notice, Carl Briggs had produced a handwritten statement, 2 pages in his cramped, arthritic script, laying out every detail of his arrangement with Eliza. The date they'd agreed, the terms, what she'd taken on, what he'd provided, what had passed between them in the way of understanding. It wasn't a legal document, but it was something, and Caleb had told her that something, combined with the silence in the sale documents, might be enough to create a genuine dispute about the scope of what Franklin Sims had actually purchased. She read Carl's statement 3 times sitting at her desk before she folded it carefully and put it with the rest of her papers. Then she went to the front room and started on supper, because the boarders still needed to eat, and the world did not slow down for anyone's legal troubles. Caleb came at his usual time that Wednesday, just after the mill whistle, appearing at the boarding house door in his work jacket with the same unhurried expression he always had. And for a moment, standing in the doorway with the cold coming off him and the supper smell coming from behind her, it felt almost ordinary. Almost like none of the last 3 days had happened. "Heard back from Marsh," he said, before she could ask. She stepped back and let him in. "And?" He's interested. He says the documents you described represent a real gap. He's seen similar structures used before, not always intentionally, sometimes just sloppiness in the drafting, but the legal effect is the same. Caleb unwound his scarf. He wants the full package. Everything you've gathered, Carl's statement, the notes from the records office. He says he can give us a proper assessment within a week. A week. She thought about her timeline. Franklin will start applying pressure before that. Probably. He hung his scarf on the hook by the door, the hook she'd never specifically told him to use, but he'd started using it 6 months ago and now it was simply his hook, and she had stopped noticing until just this moment. Which means we need to be prepared for what that pressure looks like before it arrives. Mr. Fenwick appeared from the sitting room with his cane and his curious expression. "Is this about the Sims business?" "Fenwick," Eliza said. "I have ears, girl. And I used to survey half this county. If there's something happening with property lines or documentation, I may be able to help." He lowered himself carefully into the armchair by the door. "Franklin Sims bought the Alderman pasture 3 years ago. Did you know that?" Caleb looked at him sharply. "I knew about the Alderman boundary dispute. I didn't know Sims was the buyer. Bought it through a company name, something with Western in it. Western Land Associates, I think, or something similar. Put enough distance between his name and the transaction that nobody connected it immediately." Fenwick tapped his cane against the floor. "I surveyed that pasture back in '71. There was a question about the eastern boundary and a seasonal creek. Sims bought the pasture, waited 2 seasons, then sold the water access rights to the alderman's neighbor for 3 times what the pasture had cost him. The aldermans lost their irrigation." Eliza and Caleb looked at each other. "He layers it," Eliza said slowly. "The property, the rights, the access. He buys them separately and sells them separately, and by the time anyone understands the full picture, he's already extracted what he wanted." "That's the pattern," Caleb said. "So the boarding house building is one layer," Eliza said, thinking out loud, pacing slightly. "And the business operation is another. And if I'm still running the business in a building he owns, he can, what, charge me rent I can't afford? Demand a partnership arrangement? Force me to sign something that gives him control of the accounts?" "That would be consistent," Caleb said quietly. She stopped pacing. "He wants the accounts, not the building. The business has been profitable. I've made it profitable over 2 years. And he knows that, and he wants the income stream." Fenwick nodded from his chair. "The building's worth $2,000 on a good day. A well-run boarding house in a mill town turns that in income every 18 months. The room was quiet for a moment. Cole appeared in the doorway from the kitchen looking uncertain. "Is supper—" "10 minutes," Eliza said, without looking at him. He retreated. She sat down at the dining table and spread out her notes. Caleb pulled a chair around to her side, which he had never done before. He usually sat across from her, proper distance, proper arrangement, and looked at the papers alongside her. She noticed the change and didn't comment on it. "If he wants the income stream," she said, "then the accounts are leverage. Everything I've built, the supplier relationships, the border agreements, the credit I've established, that's what has value, and none of that is in the sale documents." "None of it," Caleb confirmed. "So what does he need to get it?" "My cooperation," she said flatly. "My signature on something. He can't take over a running business without the person running it, or at least not without disrupting it badly enough that it loses value, which defeats his purpose." "You're more valuable to him running the place than gone from it," Caleb said. "Which is why Dorothy didn't threaten me. She just delivered the notice. 30 days. Enough to scare me, not enough to—" She stopped. Something was clicking into place. "She expected me to come to them. That's what the 30 days is for. It's an invitation to panic and come asking for terms." Caleb was quiet. And instead you spent 3 days building a case. Instead I spent 3 days building a case, she agreed. He looked at her papers for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "He's going to come here, Eliza, not Dorothy. Franklin himself. Probably within the week, once he understands the 30-day offer isn't working the way he expected." "I know. He won't be unpleasant. That's not his style. He'll be reasonable. He'll make an offer that sounds like generosity. I know that too. And you need to be prepared not to take it even if it sounds reasonable. Because whatever he offers first is not the best he can do. It's just the best he thinks he has to do." She looked at him. "You've dealt with men like this before." "Once or twice." His voice didn't change, but something moved behind his eyes briefly, and she didn't press it. "All right," she said. "When he comes, I don't accept anything on the spot. I listen, I say I need time to review it, and I come back to you and to Marsh." "Yes." "And in the meantime, we keep building the case." "Yes." Fenwick cleared his throat. "There's one more thing." They both looked at him. The old man had that expression he sometimes got when he was about to say something he'd been holding for a while. "The boarding house has been the only decent lodging in Bell's Mill for 2 years. You know who depends on that?" Eliza waited. "The mill workers who come in from out of county, the suppliers who stay over when the roads are bad, the doctor's patients who need to be near town for a few days." He paused. "And the families of the men who were hurt in the accident last spring. 3 of them stayed here for 6 weeks while their husbands recovered." She knew that. She remembered every one of them. "If Franklin Sims disrupts this boarding house," Fenwick said, "it's not just your livelihood that suffers. 6 people in this town have a stake in what happens here, and they don't know it yet." He looked at her steadily. "They should know it." Eliza stared at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Caleb. He was already looking at her. "The mill workers," she said. "Some of them stay here when their family homes are too far for the winter shift," Caleb said. "I know them." "And the suppliers?" "I know most of them too." She thought about what it would mean to make this visible, to let people understand what was at stake beyond just her own situation. It was a risk. People in small towns could go either way when they felt they were being pulled into something. Some would back her. Some would resent being asked, and some would make their calculations about Franklin Sims and his family money and quietly stay out of it. But Fenwick wasn't wrong. "We don't ask anyone to take a side," she said. "We just make sure people understand the situation, what's actually in those documents, what Franklin actually bought." "And what he didn't," Caleb said. "And what he didn't." Supper happened. Cole ate with nervous energy and asked too many questions that Eliza answered with just enough information to satisfy him without giving him anything he could accidentally repeat in the wrong place. Fenwick ate with the deliberate concentration of a man who believed meals deserved full attention. Caleb ate without ceremony, quickly and without complaint, the way he did everything. After supper, when Cole had gone up to his room and Fenwick had settled back into his chair with a book, Eliza washed the dishes and Caleb dried them. And this was also something that had never happened before. He'd helped clear the table a few times, but this was different, standing close in the narrow kitchen, the ordinary domestic rhythm of it. She was aware of him in the specific way she'd been trying not to be aware of him for at least the last several months. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask me anything," he said, which was, she thought, a more open answer than he usually gave. "How did you know about property law? About reading documents, about the way transfers work? You said mill business, but my father," he said. She waited. "He lost a property when I was 12. Had a verbal arrangement with the man he'd been renting from, thought he had a claim on the land because of improvements he'd made. The law didn't see it that way. He set a dry plate on the shelf with the same care he gave everything. I watched him spend 2 years trying to fight it with no documentation and no legal advice and nothing to show for it. He lost." A pause. "So I learned to read things carefully, to notice what's missing as much as what's there." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry about your father. It was a long time ago." His voice was even. "But it's why I know what I know, which is useful right now." She handed him the last cup, and he dried it. The kitchen was warm, and the lamp made the whole room amber, and outside the wind had come up, pushing against the windows. "Do you think I can win this?" she asked. not looking for reassurance, just looking for his honest read. He considered. She appreciated that he didn't answer immediately, that he actually thought about it instead of giving her something comfortable. "I think you can make it complicated enough that it stops being worth it for him," he said. "Men like Franklin Sims operate on the assumption that the other party won't fight. When the other party does fight, when they have documentation and legal counsel and people paying attention, the calculation changes. He's not going to want a protracted dispute over a boarding house. He's got other operations. So he'll back down, or he'll offer better terms than he planned to offer initially. Either way, you're not accepting the 30-day eviction, and you're not signing whatever arrangement he brings you first. What if Marsh says the gap in the documents isn't enough? Then we know where we stand and we find another angle." He put the cup on the shelf. "There's usually another angle." She turned and leaned back against the counter and looked at him directly. He met her eyes without looking away, which was, she'd noticed, something he always did. He didn't deflect or find something else to look at when a conversation got direct. "Caleb," she said, "I need to say something, and I need you to hear it without making it into something comfortable." A slight shift in his expression. He waited. "I've been on my own in this town for 2 years. I've handled everything myself, the boarding house, the suppliers, the boarders, the legal nonsense with the property tax assessment last spring, all of it. I'm not used to having someone help." She pushed her hair back from her face, a gesture she made when she was trying to be precise about something. "And I don't know what to do with it, with what you're doing. I don't know if I'm supposed to be grateful or uncomfortable, or I don't know what this is." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to know what it is," he said. "Not right now. Not while you're in the middle of all this." "But you do," she said. "Know what it is?" The pause this time was longer. "Yes," he said. She exhaled. All right, he agreed. Neither of them said anything else. She pushed off from the counter and went back to the front room, and he followed, and Fenwick looked up from his book and assessed the room with the shrewd eyes of a man who had spent 40 years reading terrain and knew when something had shifted. He said nothing, which was the kindest thing he could have done. Franklin Sims arrived on Friday morning. She had been expecting it. Caleb had predicted the week, and it had been 4 days, and the fact that it came on a Friday rather than later in the week told her Franklin had heard something. Maybe Dorothy had seen Eliza going into the records office. Maybe Carl Briggs had mentioned the conversation at the Lantern to someone who mentioned it to someone else. In a town like Bell's Mill, information traveled on its own schedule and there was no stopping it. He was not what she'd expected physically. She had built up some picture in her mind, the land-dealing type, the man who used legal structures as weapons, and expected someone harder, sharper-edged. Instead, Franklin Sims was broad and pink-faced, with a good coat and a pleasant expression and the kind of handshake that was designed to communicate trustworthiness. He was good-looking in the way of men who had always been told they were charming and had let it do too much work. "Miss Harper," he said, coming through the boarding house door like he already owned it, which technically he did, she reminded herself, and looking around at the front room with an expression of mild, benevolent approval. "I've heard a great deal about what you've done with this place." "Mr. Sims," she kept her voice neutral, "what can I do for you?" "I was hoping we could talk." He smiled. "I understand my sister's delivery of the notice may have been abrupt. That wasn't my intention. I want you to know I think what you've built here is genuinely impressive." She did not say thank you. She gestured toward the 2 chairs by the window. "Sit down." He sat. She sat across from him. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. He leaned forward slightly, the posture of a man about to make a generous offer. "I'll be direct with you. I bought this building as an investment, but I'm not interested in disrupting a successful operation. Frankly, the operation is most of the value. I'd like to propose an arrangement that keeps you in place." "What kind of arrangement?" "A lease," he said. "You lease the building from me at a rate we agree on. You keep running the business, your accounts, your boarders, your suppliers, all of it. The only change is that you're paying rent to me instead of Carl, and we have a formal written agreement rather than whatever informal arrangement you had before." She looked at him. It sounded reasonable. It was designed to sound reasonable. She thought about what Caleb had told her. that whatever he offered first was not the best he could do. "What's the rate?" she asked. He named a figure. It was not outrageous. It was maybe 15% above what would have been fair, which was carefully calibrated to feel like a reasonable negotiation point rather than an obvious squeeze. He was good at this. "I'd need to review any written agreement before I could consider it," she said, "and I'd need my own counsel to look at it." Something shifted just slightly in his expression. Not displeasure, he was too practiced for that. More like a recalibration. "Of course, that's perfectly reasonable. And I have some questions about the sale itself," she said. "The transfer documents." The shift in his expression was more visible this time. "What kind of questions?" "About what was and wasn't included in the transfer. The operating arrangements, the border agreements, the account structures." She kept her voice conversational. "There are some gaps I'd like clarity on." He looked at her for a long moment. The pleasant expression was still there, but it was doing more work now. "I'm not sure what you think is unclear. The sale was straightforward." "I'm sure it was," she said. "I just want to make sure any new agreement is built on a solid foundation. If there are questions about what was actually conveyed in the original sale, it's better to address them now." He sat back slightly. He was thinking, she could see it, running the calculation. How much does she know? Who has she talked to? What is she holding? "That sounds very prudent," he said, and now the warmth in his voice was real rather than performed, which was almost more unsettling. He was genuinely reassessing her. "Who is your counsel?" "I'm in the process of engaging someone," she said, which was true. Marsh had responded to their letter but hadn't formally agreed to represent her yet. "I expect to have more clarity by the end of the week." "Then perhaps we table this conversation until you've had a chance to consult." He stood, smoothing his coat. "I want you to know, Miss Harper, that I'm not looking for a fight. I'm looking for an arrangement that works for both of us." "I appreciate that," she said, standing also. "I'll be in touch." He gave her the handshake again. Same quality as the first one, measured, trustworthy. "I'll look forward to it." He glanced around the front room one more time with that mild approval. "You really have done remarkable things here." She walked him to the door. When he was gone, she stood in the doorway for a moment and watched him walk down Merchant Street, that confident, unhurried walk of someone who has never seriously doubted that things would go his way. Fenwick appeared behind her. "How'd it go?" "He's smart," she said, "and he knows something's different. He came in with his best face, and I think he expected me to be grateful for the lease offer." "Were you?" She thought about it honestly. "Part of me was. It was a plausible out. Keep running the business, keep my life here, just pay him rent." She paused. But the rent he named was just uncomfortable enough that it would start mattering in a bad year, and the lease would give him control over the terms going forward, and I'd have signed something that implicitly acknowledged he owned the operation. "Which he may not," Fenwick said. "Which he may not," she agreed. She went to find her coat. Caleb would be finishing at the mill in an hour. She had things to tell him. The week that followed was the most exhausting of Eliza's 2 years in Bell's Mill, and those 2 years had not been easy. She wrote letters. She answered letters. She met twice with Edmund Marsh, who had agreed to take her case, and whose careful, methodical way of assessing things reminded her, strangely and uncomfortably, of Caleb. The same habit of noticing what was missing, the same refusal to make promises he couldn't keep. Marsh thought the gap in the sale documents was genuine and meaningful. He also thought it would take time to establish, and time was the thing she had the least of. She managed the boarding house. She cooked and cleaned and tracked the accounts and handled the small crises that a boarding house produced daily. A boarder who couldn't make his rent that week. A supplier who'd shorted her on firewood. The stove's cold side getting colder in a way that was going to become a real problem in December. She handled all of it without letting it show on her face because the boarding house needed to keep running at full function, and the moment it started looking uncertain, boarders would start making other plans. She talked to people. Not dramatically, not publicly. She wasn't going to town meetings and making speeches, but in the course of the normal day she had conversations with the mill workers who stayed over on winter shifts, with the supplier from Hadley who came through every other week, with the doctor's wife who brought her husband's accounts to Eliza for help organizing. She didn't ask anyone for anything. She just made sure they understood the situation, what the boarding house provided, what a change in ownership might mean, what questions were currently being examined by legal counsel. People listened, some with sympathy, some with the careful non-commitment of people who didn't want to choose a side. But a few, Fenwick, two of the mill workers, the Hadley supplier who had been doing business with her for 18 months, said without being asked that they'd be willing to provide statements about the business arrangements if that would help. She wrote their names down. Caleb walked her home every Wednesday, and now sometimes on other evenings too. Not always, not every night, but often enough that it stopped feeling unusual and started feeling like the new shape of things. He didn't make it dramatic. He appeared and walked and talked about the case, about Marsh's progress, about what he was hearing from the mill workers about Franklin Sims's reputation. And sometimes they didn't talk about the case at all, and she'd find herself 3 blocks from the boarding house realizing they'd been discussing whether the coming winter would be worse or milder than last year's, or whether Carl Briggs would be all right on his own now that his knees were done, or some piece of history about Bell's Mill that Fenwick had told her that Caleb then corrected with a different version that turned out, when they checked, to be more accurate. He was easier to be around than anyone she'd ever known, and that ease frightened her slightly, the way anything that matters frightens you when you're not certain you can afford to lose it. On the 9th day after Franklin Sims's visit, Marsh sent word. He had reviewed everything. He had a position. He wanted to meet. She read the letter 3 times. Then she went to find Caleb. He was at the mill gate, same as the first afternoon, clipboard in hand. He looked up when he saw her coming and read her face before she said a word. "Marsh?" he said. "He has a position," she said. "He wants to meet tomorrow." Something moved across Caleb's expression. Not quite relief. Not quite hope. Something more careful than either. "What does the letter say?" "Just that he has a position and he wants to meet." She paused. "He says he thinks we have grounds." The mill noise ran behind them, and the cold air pressed in, and they stood looking at each other on the frozen ground outside the gate, and Caleb said, "All right," in the quiet way he said things when they meant more than the words did. "All right," she agreed. She turned to walk back toward Merchant Street. He fell into step beside her, the way he always did, not announcing it, not asking, just there. She didn't tell him to walk ahead. She didn't tell him she didn't need the company. She just walked, and he walked, and the town moved around them, and somewhere in the cold air between them, something that had no clear name continued to grow without asking permission from either of them. Edmund Marsh was not what Eliza had pictured from Caleb's description. She had expected someone lawyerly in the obvious way, precise, buttoned, the kind of man who communicated primarily through documents and never let his face do anything unnecessary. What she got was a heavy-set man of about 60, with ink-stained fingers and a coat that had seen better years, who shook her hand with the grip of someone who'd spent time doing physical work before he'd found his way to law, and who looked at her stack of papers the way a hungry man looks at a good meal. He had ridden in from Hadley that morning and taken the corner table at the Lantern, which was the only place in Bell's Mill with enough table space to spread documents and enough noise around it that a conversation wouldn't carry. Caleb was already there when Eliza arrived, 2 cups of coffee on the table, the documents organized in the order she'd described them in her letters. She noticed that without comment. He'd come early and set things up and hadn't mentioned it. Marsh looked up from the papers when she sat down. "Miss Harper, you did thorough work here." "Tell me what you found," she said. He liked that. She could see it. He didn't want to spend 20 minutes on pleasantries either. "All right." He spread his hands flat on the table. The sale documents are deficient in 2 meaningful ways. First, they convey the building and land but make no mention of the operating business, the existing tenant agreements, or the commercial accounts. Under county property law, a sale of real property does not automatically convey the business operated within it unless that business is explicitly named and transferred. "So he bought the building," Eliza said, "not the boarding house." "That is the argument," Marsh said carefully. "It's not without complication. Franklin's counsel will argue that the business is inseparable from the building, that you can't meaningfully distinguish between the structure and the operation housed in it. That's a position with some legal support, but it's not the only position, and the silence in the document is significant." "What's the second deficiency?" Caleb asked. Marsh picked up Carl's handwritten statement. The arrangement between Miss Harper and Carl Briggs was specific and ongoing. Miss Harper made substantial improvements to the property under that arrangement: the account system she built, the supplier relationships, the border base. Those represent what the law sometimes calls betterments. Improvements made by an operator under an informal arrangement can create a claim against the property interest, particularly when the sale documents don't address them. Eliza stared at him. A claim against Franklin's property interest. A potential claim, not a guaranteed one. Marsh was careful with his words, she noticed. He didn't inflate and he didn't deflate. What I'm saying is that you have grounds for a dispute, a genuine one. Whether that dispute produces a ruling in your favor depends on factors I can't fully predict. But it's real enough that a man in Franklin Sims's position, a man who operates the way he does, would have reason to take it seriously. She thought about what Caleb had said, that the goal wasn't necessarily to win outright, but to make the situation complicated enough that it stopped being worth it for Franklin. "What do you recommend?" she asked. "I recommend we file a formal objection to the transfer, a notice of dispute, essentially, with the county recorder's office. That puts the dispute on the public record. It means Franklin cannot quietly resell or refinance the property without the dispute appearing. It creates friction." Marsh folded his hands. "And then we notify Franklin's counsel directly. Not threatening, not aggressive, just factual. We have a position, here's the basis, here's the documentation. We'd like to discuss a resolution." "What resolution do we want?" Caleb asked. Both Marsh and Eliza looked at him. He looked back steadily. "It's a fair question," Eliza said. She'd been thinking about this. "I don't want to buy the building. I don't have the money, and I wouldn't know what to do with property. What I want is a long-term lease at a fair rate, with terms that protect the operation. Fixed rent for at least 5 years. No provisions that give him control over the business accounts or the border agreements. No clause that lets him terminate with less than 6 months' notice without cause." Marsh was writing. "That's a reasonable ask. Given the dispute we're raising, he may be more inclined to offer those terms than he would have been otherwise." "He came to see me 9 days ago," she said. "He offered a lease. The rate wasn't fair and the terms weren't spelled out." "He'll come back with better terms," Marsh said, "especially once he knows you have counsel and a filed dispute." "How long before we can file?" "I can have the notice ready within 3 days. I'll need you to sign it, and I'll need Carl Briggs to confirm his statement in front of a witness." "Carl will do that," she said. "I'll make sure of it." Marsh looked between them. "Is there anything else I should know about this situation? Anyone else who might complicate this?" "Dorothy Sims," Caleb said. "She's Franklin's face in Bell's Mill. She handles relationships here. She's going to know about this filing within days of it happening, and she's going to make her feelings known." "Let her," Eliza said. Both men looked at her. "I've been in this town 2 years," she said. "Dorothy Sims has been here her whole life, and she's spent most of it reminding people of that fact. But the people I need on my side aren't the ones who listen to Dorothy. They're the ones who've been eating breakfast in my dining room and sending their suppliers to stay here and bringing their families here when their husbands were hurt." She paused. "I'm not worried about Dorothy." Marsh smiled. "A real one, not a professional one." "All right, Miss Harper, let's file your dispute." They shook hands. Marsh gathered his papers and went back to his room at the lantern to start the documents. Eliza and Caleb sat for a moment in the corner of the bar, with the noise of the lunch crowd building around them. "Well?" Caleb said. "Well," she agreed. "How do you feel?" She thought about it. "Like I'm standing on something that might hold, which is better than feeling like I'm falling." He nodded. "That's something." "It's not enough yet." "No," he agreed, "but it's a real position. We weren't sure we'd have one." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. The lantern was filling up, mill workers coming in for the midday meal, the usual Bell's Mill faces cycling through, and she noticed, across the room, 2 of the regular workers nodding at Caleb with the easy familiarity of men who respected the person above them without making a ceremony of it. She also noticed the moment one of them clocked her at the same table, and the small, almost invisible recalibration that happened in his expression, something between curiosity and reassessment. She had been a woman who ran the boarding house. Now she was becoming something else in people's eyes, and she wasn't sure yet what that something else was. Your workers are going to hear about this filing, she said. Some of them already know the general situation. Mill towns. He shrugged slightly. Information moves. Are any of them going to make trouble? For you, I mean, if they think you're involved in something against the Sims family. He looked at her. Dorothy Sims doesn't have influence with the mill workers. Franklin doesn't either. The mill is its own... He paused, choosing. It's its own world. What happens in the mill is separate from what the Sims family does with land. You're sure? I'm sure about my people, he said, which was not quite the same thing, and he knew it, and she appreciated that he didn't pretend it was. Carl Briggs confirmed his statement 2 days later, sitting in the front room of the boarding house with Fenwick as witness. Fenwick had, it turned out, notarized documents for half the county during his surveying years and still had the stamp slightly dented but functional. Carl signed with a hand that shook slightly and then sat back and looked at Eliza with an expression that was half guilty and half relieved. You're going to be all right, he said. You're smart enough to be all right. I know, she said, not because she was certain of it, but because telling him otherwise would only make him feel worse, and he already felt bad enough. The dispute notice was filed on a Thursday. By Saturday, Dorothy Sims was standing in the boarding house doorway. She wasn't doing the pleasant smile this time. She was doing something else, something that wore the expression of concern and smelled like a threat. Eliza, she said, coming through the door without being invited. I think we need to talk. Eliza was at the front desk. She set down her pen and gave Dorothy her full attention. All right. Dorothy settled herself in the chair across from the desk like she was paying a social call. I heard about your filing. It's a public record. Anyone can hear about it. I understand you have legal counsel now. That's correct. I want you to understand something. Dorothy's voice was even, careful in the way of a person who has rehearsed. My brother is not your enemy. He's a businessman. The filing you've made is going to complicate things unnecessarily, and I think if you'd been given better advice, you wouldn't have... Dorothy. Eliza's voice was quiet, but it stopped the other woman mid-sentence. I'd like you to do me a favor. Dorothy blinked. I'd like you to tell your brother that I'm happy to discuss a resolution. My counsel has a clear picture of what I'm asking for. If Franklin wants to meet, we can meet. But the filing stays in place until there's a written agreement, and I won't be signing anything without my lawyer reviewing it first. Dorothy stared at her. Those are my terms for a conversation, Eliza said. If they don't suit him, we can let the legal process run its course. You don't know what you're risking, Dorothy said, and now the pleasantness was gone entirely, and what was underneath it was not quite anger, more like genuine conviction. Franklin has resources. He has relationships with people in this county who, I have a filed legal dispute, a lawyer, and the statements of 6 people in this town who are prepared to speak to the nature of my business here. Eliza folded her hands on the desk. I'm not trying to make an enemy of your brother, Dorothy. I'm trying to make a fair arrangement. Those are different things. The room held itself still for a moment. Mr. Fenwick was somewhere in the back of the house. She could hear him moving around, the tap of his cane. Cole was upstairs. The stove in the kitchen ticked. Dorothy stood up. I'll tell him, she said, and left without the gloves performance this time, just out the door and gone. Eliza sat at the desk for a moment after the door closed. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the ledger. Her hand was not shaking this time. What she hadn't expected, couldn't have predicted, was what happened 4 days later. She had been in the kitchen when Cole knocked on the doorframe, looking uncomfortable in the specific way he looked when he was about to deliver information he didn't know what to do with. There's someone here to see you, he said. Not Franklin Sims, the other one, the one who manages the Western Land Company. She looked up. What? He introduced himself as the managing agent, said his name is Harper. He wants to talk. She wiped her hands and went to the front room. The man standing by the window was about 40, spare and precise-looking, with a leather satchel and the eyes of someone who spent their working life reading documents. He did not have Franklin's warmth or Dorothy's social ease. He had the neutral, instrumental quality of someone whose job was to make problems go away at the lowest possible cost. Miss Harper, he said, I'm James Harder. I manage legal and property affairs for Western Land Associates. I know who you are, she said, which was mostly true. Fenwick had mentioned the company name, and she'd found the associated documents in the county records and worked out the general structure. He didn't seem surprised that she knew. Then you know I'm not here in a personal capacity. I'm here because the dispute notice you filed represents a complication to several transactions, not just the boarding house sale. She hadn't known that. She kept her face still. All right. Western Land has 3 pending arrangements in Bells Mill County that are contingent on clean title to various properties. Your filing doesn't directly affect those arrangements, but it creates a pattern in the public record that he paused. That raises questions that certain parties would prefer not have raised. She looked at him steadily. What are you telling me, Mr. Harder? I'm telling you that there are people above Franklin Sims who would prefer this matter resolved quickly and cleanly. He set his satchel on the chair beside him and opened it with the precise motions of someone who had done this 10,000 times. I'm authorized to offer you a formal long-term lease agreement, 15 years, fixed rate, below what my principal initially discussed with you. The terms include full protection of your business operation, your accounts, and your existing tenant arrangements. No provisions for early termination without 12 months' notice and demonstrated cause. He produced a document. You can have your lawyer review this. I believe you'll find it satisfactory. She looked at the document on the desk between them. She thought about Caleb saying, whatever he offers first is not the best he can do. She thought about Marsh saying, we have grounds for a dispute, a genuine one. She thought about Fenwick saying, you don't know how far this travels. She did not reach for the document. I'll have my counsel review it, she said. As I said to Dorothy, I'm not signing anything without that step. Of course. He closed his satchel. I'd like a response within 4 days, if that's workable, given the other arrangements I mentioned. Give me a week, she said. He looked at her for a moment. 5 days. 6, she said. And I'll have an answer. A pause. 6 days, he agreed. He left more efficiently than Dorothy had. No lingering, no social display, just out the door and gone because he was there to do a job and the job was moving to its next stage. Eliza stood at the front desk and looked at the document he'd left behind. She read it twice without touching it. Then she put her coat on and went to find Caleb. He was at the mill, in the middle of something involving a belt mechanism that had been giving trouble. She could tell from his expression when he came out to the gate that he'd been interrupted from a problem he wanted to get back to, but he came without saying so. She told him about Harder, about the document, about the 15-year lease and the 12-month termination notice and the fixed rate. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The other arrangements he mentioned, he said, the 3 pending transactions. I thought about that. Franklin has partners in those deals, people who don't want noise in the county record right now. That's why Harder is here instead of Franklin. They pushed Franklin to settle, she said. His partners pushed him. Yes. Caleb looked at the document she was holding. And Harder came with better terms than Franklin was going to offer because the partners told him to make it go away, and making it go away means making you happy enough not to press the dispute. She thought about that. Which means I have more leverage than I thought. Right now, yes. For the next 6 days, yes. What do you think about the terms? He held out his hand for the document. She gave it to him, and he read it, standing at the mill gate with the cold and the noise, reading with the focused attention he brought to everything. She watched his face and got almost nothing from it, which was both frustrating and, in a strange way, reassuring because it meant he was actually thinking and not performing. The rate is fair, he said finally. Better than fair, actually. The termination clause is strong. The language protecting your business operation is... He read a passage again. It's clear. It would be hard for them to argue around it. But... She could hear one. He handed the document back. The lease is with Western Land Associates, not Franklin personally. That's the company structure. If the company transfers, dissolves, or restructures, there's a question about what happens to the lease. She stared at him. He could sell the company, or restructure it, create a subsidiary. There are ways to move a lease obligation that look legal on paper and change who you're actually dealing with. She looked down at the document with entirely new eyes. Marsh needs to look at this. Marsh needs to look at this today, Caleb agreed. She sent a message to the Lantern where Marsh was still staying, and he came within the hour and read the document at her dining room table, with Fenwick looking on, and Caleb standing by the window, and Cole making more coffee than anyone needed. Marsh read it twice. "Your man's right," he said to Eliza, which made her aware that he'd understood the nature of the situation without being told explicitly. "The company structure is the exposure. We need an assignment clause. If Western Land assigns or transfers this lease, you have the right to approve the new party or terminate. Standard in commercial leases not always included. We also need a right of first refusal if Franklin ever tries to sell the building." "Can we ask for that?" she said. "We can ask. They may push back on the right of first refusal. It limits their flexibility. But the assignment clause is reasonable, and they'd have trouble arguing against it without revealing that they're planning to move the structure, which they won't want to admit in a negotiation." "So we go back to Harder with modifications," she said. "Two modifications. The assignment clause and the right of first refusal. I'll draft the language tonight." She looked at Caleb. He was looking at Marsh with the expression he had when he was deciding whether to trust someone's work, and she could see him concluding yes. "5 days left," she said. "Plenty of time," Marsh said. It was not, as it turned out, plenty of time. Not because the law moved too slowly, but because Franklin Sims did something she hadn't predicted. He came himself. Not through Dorothy, not through Harder. He showed up at the boarding house on the third morning after Harder's visit, alone, without his coat, which struck her as the detail she noticed first. A man who had been impeccably presented on every prior occasion, showing up without his coat in November weather. He stood at her front door looking less like a businessman and more like a man who'd had a bad few days. She let him in. He sat where he'd sat before, in the chair by the window, but nothing else about the visit was the same as the first one. "I want to talk to you directly," he said. "Not through Harder, not through Dorothy." "All right," she said, and sat across from him. "The filing you made—" He stopped, started again. "I want you to understand that when I bought this building from Carl, I wasn't trying to take something from you. I saw an opportunity. I took it. I thought you'd—" He looked at his hands. "I thought you'd accept the situation. I misjudged that." She looked at him. She had expected to feel satisfaction at this moment, or something like it, but what she actually felt was more complicated. Something like pity, not the comfortable kind, just a recognition that the man across from her had made calculations that hadn't accounted for the specific person he was dealing with. "What do you want, Franklin?" she said. "I want to settle this." His voice was flat now, stripped of the performance. "My partners are angry. Harder tells me you identified the assignment issue, which—" a short exhale. "Which means you're smarter than I gave you credit for. I gave you too little credit. That was a mistake I've made before." He looked at her. "What do you actually need to make this go away?" She had rehearsed this answer because she'd known eventually someone would ask it directly. "A lease in my name, not a company name," she said. 15 years. The rate Harder offered. Assignment clause requiring my approval of any transfer. Right of first refusal if you sell the building. And a formal acknowledgement in writing that the business operation, the accounts, the border agreements, the supplier relationships, was never part of the original sale. He flinched at the last one. "That acknowledgement creates a record." "Yes," she said, "it does." "If I acknowledge the sale didn't include the business, You're acknowledging what was true," she said quietly. "The documents don't lie, Franklin. Marsh and I didn't invent the gap. It was there because whoever drafted your sale didn't think it through, or because you hoped it would give you something to come back for. Either way, the truth of the transaction doesn't change depending on whether you write it down." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that Fenwick's cane tapped once, somewhere in the back of the house, and they both heard it. "The acknowledgement," Franklin said finally. "Does it have to be public?" "It has to be in the agreement. The agreement goes to Marsh and to me and to your counsel. It doesn't need to be filed with the county if the dispute is withdrawn." He absorbed that. "And you'd withdraw the dispute once the agreement is signed." "Once the agreement is signed and the lease is executed, yes." Another long silence. All right, he said. 2 words. She had worked 3 weeks for 2 words, and they landed without drama, without the satisfaction she might have imagined, because real things so rarely come with the feeling you expected them to. I'll have Marsh send the language to your counsel, she said. He nodded. He stood up. He was reaching for his coat, which he wasn't wearing, and his hand found nothing, and he stood there for a second, slightly wrong-footed, and it was the most human thing she'd seen him do. He walked to the door. Miss Harper, he said, with his hand on the frame. She waited. I shouldn't have sent Dorothy, he said. First time something like this has gone the way it went. Usually people... He shook his head. Never mind. He left. She sat at the front desk for a long time after the door closed, the document Harder had brought still sitting where she'd left it, and the modifications Marsh had drafted sitting next to it, and Carl's handwritten statement underneath both of them. And she thought about her first day in Bell's Mill standing on Constance Pence's porch, with a letter that had turned to nothing in her hands. She thought about 2 years of making something out of not much. She thought about what Caleb had said weeks ago, standing outside the mill gate, that his Wednesday was the part of the week he didn't have to think hard about. She thought about all the things that had been growing, unnamed, in the space between them. She needed to tell him. Not tonight. Tonight there was still work, Marsh's language to confirm, a message to send, the borders to feed, the cold side of the stove to argue with. But soon, because there was a thing she understood now, after 3 weeks of watching a quiet man show up without being asked, without making her feel she owed him, without once suggesting she was handling things wrong or should slow down or didn't know what she was doing, she understood that some things that look like kindness are actually something more specific than kindness, and some people who show up consistently are showing you something true about themselves. And the mistake you can make is to keep calling it by the wrong name until you've waited too long to call it by the right one. She picked up her pen. She had a letter to write to Marsh, and after that, she had something to say to Caleb Whitmore that she'd been building toward for a long time and was finally, for the first time, not afraid to say. The letter to Marsh went out that same evening, and by the following morning, the negotiations had moved into the specific grinding language of legal drafting. Marsh and Franklin's counsel exchanging proposed text, arguing over single words and clauses, the kind of work that was unglamorous and necessary, and that Eliza had learned to take seriously rather than find tedious, because she'd seen firsthand what happened when people didn't take it seriously. She sent Caleb a note through one of the mill workers. 3 sentences. Franklin came himself. He agreed in principle. Marsh is handling the language. He sent back 2 words on the same slip of paper, turned over. Good work. She stood in the kitchen holding that slip of paper and felt something she didn't immediately have a name for. Not just satisfaction, something warmer and more specific than satisfaction. She folded the paper and put it in her apron pocket and went back to the stove, which was still running cold on the left side and had developed an additional complaint on the right side that she hadn't fully diagnosed yet. The next 4 days were the strange, suspended kind that come after a crisis has passed its peak, but before anything is actually resolved. The legal language moved back and forth between Marsh and Franklin's man. There were 2 points of genuine friction, the right of first refusal, which Franklin's counsel pushed back on hard, and the precise wording of the acknowledgement clause, which they tried 3 times to soften into something that technically said the same thing while meaning something different. And Marsh caught every attempt with the patience of someone who had seen the same tricks many times. Eliza ran the boarding house. She fixed the stove. The right side complaint turned out to be a cracked flue baffle that she patched with fire clay she ordered from the hardware supplier, a job that took most of a Saturday afternoon and left her hands gray and smelling of mineral. She renegotiated the firewood delivery for December, getting a better rate from the supplier than she'd had the previous year because she now had the confirmed lease to show as proof of continued operation. She had a long conversation with the doctor's wife about potentially designating one room as a recovery room for patients who needed to stay near town at a reduced weekly rate in exchange for the doctor's formal endorsement of the boarding house for out-of-town visitors. She did all of this while also tracking the legal negotiations, answering Marsh's questions by return message, and managing the specific social landscape of Bell's Mill, which had shifted subtly since the filing became public knowledge. People were paying attention in a new way. Some of them, she thought, were simply waiting to see how it came out. But a few, Fenwick's two millworker contacts, the Hadley supplier, the doctor's wife, had moved from passive awareness to something more like active investment. They asked how things were going. They offered what they had. The doctor's wife brought her a jar of pickled vegetables from her cellar, which was Bell's Mill's version of expressing solidarity. Caleb came by on Wednesday, as he always did, and on two other evenings that week. And on those other evenings, they didn't talk much about the negotiations because there wasn't much to say that Marsh wasn't already handling. They talked about other things. The mill's winter preparations, Fenwick's hip, which had been giving him trouble in the cold. The question of whether coal was going to stay through the winter or take the salesman route south. It was easy in the way conversations are easy when two people have stopped needing to perform for each other, and Eliza was aware of it even as it was happening. The particular comfort of not having to explain yourself, of being able to say a half-formed thing and have it understood. She still hadn't said what she'd decided she needed to say. The timing was wrong, or she told herself it was. The negotiations were still open, she was still in the middle of things. She didn't want to introduce something new and destabilizing into a situation that was finally stabilizing. She was aware that this was partly true and partly an excuse, and she was honest enough with herself to know the difference. The agreement was finalized on a Thursday, 12 days after Franklin Sims had stood in her doorway without his coat and said, "All right." Marsh brought the papers to the boarding house himself, riding in from Hadley with a saddlebag full of documents and the quiet satisfaction of a man who had negotiated a good outcome. The right of first refusal was in. The assignment clause was in. The acknowledgement was in, not softened, not hedged, clear and plain in the language that Marsh had insisted on. The original sale of the property did not include the operating business, accounts, or tenant agreements of the boarding house operation, which remained wholly the property and responsibility of Eliza Harper. 15 years. Fixed rate. 12 months' notice for termination without cause. She read the full document at her desk. It took 40 minutes. Marsh sat across from her and drank coffee and didn't rush her. When she finished, she looked up. "It says what we wanted it to say." "It does," he said. "And you're confident in the language." "I wrote half of it and argued the other half into better shape. Yes, I'm confident." She picked up the pen. She signed her name in the 3 places he'd marked, and each time she put pen to paper it felt like pressing something into permanence. Not just the document, but the 2 years she'd spent building what the document was now protecting. When it was done, she set the pen down and looked at the signed papers and felt, unexpectedly, the need to sit still for a moment without talking. Marsh seemed to understand. He refilled his own coffee and left her to it. After a while she said, "What do I owe you?" He named a figure. It was less than she'd braced for. She said so. "You did most of the work," he said simply. "The documentation, the research, the records. I structured it and drafted the language. That's worth what I'm charging, not more." She nodded. "I'll get you the first half before you leave today, the rest by the end of the month." "That works." He gathered his copies of the document. "Miss Harper, I've handled a fair number of property disputes. Most of them end one of 3 ways. The little party gets crushed, the big party gets tired, or both sides find something they can live with. You found the third way faster than I expected, and with better terms than I thought we'd get." He looked at her directly. "That's not because the law was on your side. The law was on your side enough to create uncertainty, which is different. What actually moved this was that you knew what you were looking for, you found it, and you were clear about what you wanted. That's not legal work. That's just knowing your own mind." She looked at him. "Thank you. I'll send a note to Caleb Whitmore as well. His introduction got this started." "I know," she said. "I'll thank him myself." Marsh left mid-afternoon. Fenwick, who had been hovering at the edges of the morning with barely suppressed curiosity, came into the front room the moment the door closed and looked at her face and said, "Well?" 15 years, she said. He sat down in his chair with a breath that was almost a laugh. 15 years. Fixed rate assignment clause. Right of first refusal. She set the signed document on the desk, and an acknowledgement that the business was never part of the original sale. He looked at the papers from across the room. He signed the acknowledgement. Fenwick was quiet for a moment. Dorothy is going to be furious. Dorothy was always going to be furious about something, Eliza said. That's not new. He made the sound he made when he was trying not to smile and not quite succeeding. What happens now? Now I go tell Caleb, she said, and then I come back and make supper. She put on her coat, all the way buttoned because the cold had gotten serious, and walked to the mill. Caleb was at the gate, which was where she'd known he would be. End of the afternoon shift, clipboard, pencil behind his ear. He saw her coming, and she watched his face read her expression the way he always read things, quickly and without show. "It's done?" he said. "It's done." She stopped in front of him. 15 years, everything we asked for. He exhaled. A small exhale. Not dramatic, just the release of something that had been held. Good. He signed the acknowledgement. That landed differently. Something moved in his face. Not surprise exactly, more like a final piece of something settling into place. That was the hardest ask. Marsh held firm. "You held firm," he said. "Marsh drafted it. You told him not to accept anything less." She looked at him standing in the cold at the mill gate and thought about everything that had happened since the afternoon he'd fallen in to step beside her outside the same gate, and she'd told him she didn't need him to walk with her, and he'd walked anyway. 3 weeks. It felt longer, felt like something that had been building much longer than 3 weeks, like the 3 weeks had just been the part of it that became visible. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "When you told me, a while ago, that your Wednesday was the part of the week you didn't have to think hard about." She watched his face. "Did you mean it the way I think you meant it?" He looked at her steadily. "How do you think you meant it?" "That it wasn't just habit or obligation, or the kind of thing you do because it's the right thing to do." She paused. "That it was something more than that." "Yes," he said, simple and without decoration. "That's what I meant." She nodded slowly. "I need to tell you something, and I've been putting it off because the timing was wrong, and now the timing is less wrong, and I don't want to keep not saying it." He waited. The mill noise ran behind him, and a few workers moved past them toward the gate without paying much attention. "I don't know how to do this well," she said. "I've been on my own long enough that I've lost the habit of letting things be what they are instead of what I can manage them into being." She looked down at her gloves for a moment, then back at him. "You've been showing up for me for 2 years, and for the last 3 weeks you've been—" She stopped. "I know what it cost you, in time and in involvement and in the kind of thing people in this town notice and form opinions about, and you never once made me feel like I owed you for it." "You don't," he said. "I know I don't. That's not what I'm saying." She pushed her hair back from her face, the gesture she made when she was trying to be precise. "I'm saying I see it. I see what you've been doing, and I understand what it means, and I've been calling it by the wrong name for a long time because calling it by the right name scared me." The workers at the gate had moved through. They were briefly alone in the space in front of the mill entrance, just the cold and the gray sky and the distant sound of the river. "What name do you want to call it?" Caleb said. She looked at him. "What do you want me to call it?" A long pause. He was not a man who said things quickly, and she had learned not to rush him, because what came out when she didn't rush him was always more true than what came out when she did. "I'd like you to call it what it is," he said finally, "which is that I'd like to keep walking with you, not just on Wednesdays." She felt the warmth of that land somewhere in her chest and spread in both directions. "I'd like that," she said, and then, because she was not built for soft exits, "But you should know I'm not easy to be with. I'm stubborn, and I keep my own accounts, and I don't naturally let people in, and there are days when I will shut a door that I should probably leave open." "I know," he said, "and I know who you are, Eliza." His voice was quiet, but it had weight. "I've been watching you for 2 years. I don't have a picture in my head of someone easier. I have a picture of you." She stood very still for a moment. "All right," she said, and her voice was steadier than she'd expected. "All right," he agreed. They walked back toward Merchant Street. Not the way they usually walked, not with the particular formality of a man walking a woman home, the specific social arrangement that Bell's Mill had been watching and speculating about for 2 years. Just two people walking the same direction, close enough that their arms touched when the sidewalk narrowed, neither of them moving away. It was a small thing. In Bell's Mill, it was not a small thing. She noticed three separate people notice. She found she didn't mind. What she hadn't anticipated was how much harder the weeks immediately after the agreement would be, in a specific and unexpected way. Not harder because of Franklin or Dorothy or anything legal. That was over, or as over as it was going to get. Harder because of what happened inside the boarding house when people understood that she'd won. The first person to say anything was the Hadley supplier, who came through on his regular visit the week after the signing and shook her hand with genuine warmth and said he'd heard the news and he was glad. That was fine. That was normal. What wasn't quite normal was Cole. Cole had been at the boarding house for 4 months. He was 25 and easily overwhelmed and had a tendency to knock on door frames at inconvenient moments. But he was also, she realized, watching him in the week after the signing, someone Jewel who had been paying attention to everything that had happened and had found in it something he hadn't expected to find. He started being more useful. Not dramatically, he didn't make speeches about it. He just started noticing things that needed doing and doing them without being asked. The wood box by the stove one morning filled before she'd gotten to it. The front steps sanded when the frost made them slippery. A note left on the desk telling her the room 4 window latch was loose and he'd tightened it. She noticed and said nothing because acknowledging it directly would embarrass him. But she noticed. Fenwick noticed too. "Boy's growing up a little," he said one evening, with the particular dryness of a 71-year-old who had seen every version of a young person trying to figure out what they stood for. "He is," she agreed. "You did that." "I didn't do anything." Fenwick gave her the look he gave when he thought she was being deliberately obtuse. "You showed him what it looks like when someone doesn't give up. That does something to young people. They don't always know how to say it, so they fill the wood box instead." She thought about that for a long time after he went to bed. The thing about having fought for something and won, she was discovering, was that it changed the texture of everything around you. Not just the big things, but the ordinary daily things. The way the front room felt in the morning, the way she moved through the accounts, the way she thought about next month and the month after that. For 2 years, she had been managing survival. Not crisis exactly, but the particular low-level vigilance of someone who knows their situation is not secure. And now the situation was secure. 15 years of it was secure. She didn't know, immediately, how to hold that. She talked to Caleb about it one evening, an evening he'd come by without a specific reason, which was the new normal, and they'd ended up at the kitchen table with coffee and the kind of conversation that didn't have an agenda. "I feel like I should feel more than I feel," she said. "I should feel settled, but instead I feel like I'm waiting for the next thing to go wrong." He wrapped his hands around his cup. "That's not unusual." "You felt that?" "After the mill's boundary dispute 3 years ago, we resolved it. I'd spent months on it. When it was done, I spent another 2 weeks expecting it to come undone somehow." "Did it?" "No." He looked at his coffee. "Eventually, I stopped waiting and started just running the mill. It took longer than it should have." "How did you stop waiting?" He thought about it. "I started paying attention to the things that were working instead of the things that might break. Not ignoring the risks, just..." He paused. The boundary dispute was done. The mill was still there. The people in it were still working. I started paying attention to that. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight. "What's working?" she asked. "Meaning, what do you pay attention to now?" He looked back at her. "You know what I pay attention to." She felt the warmth of it, the same warmth she'd felt at the mill gate when he'd said he had a picture of her. "I'm trying to learn how to do that," she said. "Pay attention to what's working." "You're better at it than you think," he said. "You've been doing it. The stove, the room 4 window, the firewood rate, the doctor's wife arrangement, all of that is paying attention to what's working and making it work better. That's just managing the house." "That's not just anything," he said. And he said it with the particular quiet certainty that meant he wasn't trying to make her feel good. He was saying what he believed. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Will you stay for supper?" He blinked, a small pause visible. He had never stayed for supper. He'd eaten food she'd handed him in the kitchen more than once, stood at the counter and eaten a biscuit or a piece of bread while they talked about something, but he'd never sat down at the table with the boarders for a meal. "Yes," he said. Yes. "It's fine," she said. "Fenwick will be insufferable about it." "I know. He'll make comments all evening." "Fenwick makes comments all evening regardless," Caleb said. She laughed, genuinely, the way she'd been laughing more in the past few weeks than she had in the entire 2 years before. She went to start supper and he stayed at the table, and at some point she handed him a knife and a pile of potatoes without thinking about it, and he started cutting them without comment. And they cooked in the same kitchen the way two people cook in a kitchen when they've figured out how to be in the same space, moving around each other without negotiating it, knowing who was doing what. Fenwick came in, took in the situation with one sweep of his sharp old eyes, and sat down at the table with an expression of profound and barely restrained satisfaction. He made exactly as many comments as she'd predicted. Caleb absorbed them with the patience he brought to most things. Cole came down, found Caleb at the table, and after a moment of visible recalibration, sat down and started passing plates without making it weird, which was, Eliza thought, the most adult thing she'd ever seen Cole do. Supper was noisy and ordinary and a little chaotic because the stove ran hot on one side and the soup had caught slightly, and Fenwick knocked his water glass and Cole caught it, and Caleb ate 3 servings of bread without commenting on it, which she noted and filed away as information about him. After, when Cole had gone up and Fenwick had drifted to his chair and the kitchen was quiet, Eliza washed and Caleb dried, and they talked about the mill's December schedule and whether the river would ice early this year, and whether Carl Briggs was managing on his own, which he mostly was. And these were not dramatic or significant topics, but they had the weight of dailiness, the substance of two people building a habit of knowing each other's ordinary life. "I want to show you something," Caleb said when the dishes were done. She looked at him. "Now?" "If you have time." She had time. She put her coat on and they walked west, away from the boarding house, away from the mill, west through Bell's Mill, toward the edge where the town thinned out into land. She'd never walked west before. She always walked east or toward the mill or to the records office or the lantern or the general store. The streets she knew were the streets of her life in Bell's Mill, which had been built east of center. West was different. The houses got quieter and more spread out. The road turned from packed gravel to something softer, and after about 10 minutes of walking they reached a small cabin. Not large, not impressive, solidly built in the way of someone who built things to last rather than to look good, set back from the road with a woodpile stacked along one wall and a narrow porch facing south. Caleb stopped at the porch. "This is yours," she said. "Yes." She looked at it. She'd known, abstractly, that he had a home somewhere west of town. Had known it since the beginning, since the first Wednesday night, when she'd realized he was walking a full hour out of his way to see her safely to her door. But she'd never seen it. "Can I?" she started. "Yes," he said. "That's why we're here." Inside was plain in the specific way of a man who has organized his life around function and hasn't spent much time thinking about comfort. Not dirty, clean in fact, the kind of clean that comes from discipline rather than attention to aesthetics, but spare. A table, 2 chairs. A stove that was, she noticed immediately, properly maintained. Shelves of carefully ordered tools, ledgers, a few books. A narrow bed with a good quilt, a window facing east. She stood in the middle of it and looked around. "You built this," she said. Not a question. "My 2nd year here," he said. "Before that I was boarding at the Lantern." She turned around slowly. "The east window. Gets the morning light." He was watching her, not the room, watching her look at his life and trying to read what she found. She turned back to him. "You've been living here for 3 years." "Yes." "Alone." "Yes." She looked at the 2 chairs at the table. "You have 2 chairs." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite embarrassed, something more complicated than that. "I built the 2nd one a while ago. I thought—" He stopped. "I thought eventually there'd be someone to sit in it." She stood very still. The stove was warm and the single lamp made the room amber, and outside the cold pressed against the windows, and she looked at the 2nd chair, plain wood, same make as the first, clearly the same hands, And she thought about the specific loneliness of a man who builds the chair before the person arrives, who makes room for someone in the dailiness of his life before he knows they'll fill it. "You built the chair before you knew who'd sit in it," she said. "Yes." His voice was even, but it cost something. She looked at him. He was standing by the door, not crowding her, leaving her the space to look and think and decide, which was what he always did. He never pushed, never crowded, never made her feel the decision was already made. He gave her room and waited. "I want to sit in it," she said. He exhaled. She sat down in the second chair, at the table, in the warm amber room that smelled of wood and work and the particular clean of a disciplined man's private life, and Caleb sat down in the first chair, and they were at a table together in the way she'd imagined 100 times without letting herself imagine it. And nothing about it was romantic in the obvious way, no flourish or ceremony, just two people sitting down at a table together, which is its own kind of declaration. "I'm not going to be easy," she said, because she'd said it before and it bore repeating. "I know," he said, "and you're going to have to talk more than you naturally want to. I need words. I don't function well on silence." He looked like he was processing the terms of something. "I can do that. And I'm going to have opinions about your firewood stacking. That's not something I can control." The corner of his mouth did the thing it did. "My firewood stacking is fine." "It's inefficient," she said. "You lose heat because the stack is too far from the—" "Eliza." "Yes?" "I know," he said. "I heard you the first time. Both times, actually." He looked at her across the table with the steady, unhurried attention that had been one of the first things she'd noticed about him, and one of the last things she'd admitted she loved about him. "I'm asking you to stay." The word "stay" in his mouth had a specific weight, not dramatic, not performative, just true. Stay not for an evening. Stay in the way that matters. She looked at him. She thought about 2 years of Wednesday nights, about the hook by the door that had become his hook, about the kitchen in the boarding house where they'd cooked together without negotiating it, about the second chair. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Outside, Bell's Mill went about its evening, lamps and windows, the distant sound of the river, the cold doing its patient work on the world. Inside the small cabin west of town, two people who had been circling each other for 2 years sat at a table and said the things that needed saying, and some of what they said was careful, and some of it was clumsy, and some of it made both of them laugh in the quiet way of people who are surprised by how easy something can be when they finally stop making it hard. She didn't get back to the boarding house until late. Fenwick was still in his chair, awake, book in his lap. He looked at her face and did not ask a single question. "Good night, Fenwick," she said. "Good night, girl," he said, and went back to his book, and the boarding house settled around her, warm and familiar and 15 years certain. And outside the east window, the night was clear and cold and full of stars. December came in hard that year, the kind of cold that didn't announce itself gradually, but arrived one morning as a settled fact. Ice on the water barrel, and frost thick on the boarding house windows, and the river making sounds it only made when it was thinking about freezing. Eliza woke early, as she always did, and stood in the kitchen while the stove came up to heat and thought about the shape of her life, which had changed enough in the past month that she sometimes caught herself not recognizing it. Not in a bad way. In the way of something that fits better than what came before, which takes its own kind of adjustment because you've spent so long accommodating the old shape that the new one catches you off guard. She and Caleb had not made any formal announcement. They didn't have to. Bell's Mill was a town of fewer than 400 people, and it had eyes the way small towns always have eyes. And the change in the way two people moved around each other was the kind of thing that got noticed and discussed and filed away long before anyone said anything official. Eliza had walked west twice more since the evening of the second chair. Caleb had come to supper 3 times. He'd fixed the boarding house's east side gutter on a Saturday morning without being asked, climbing up in the cold with tools he'd brought from the mill, and the fact that he'd done it without mentioning it first was the kind of thing that would have irritated her once. Felt presumptuous, felt like someone making decisions about her property without consulting her, but somehow, from him, it didn't land that way. He'd come down from the ladder covered in leaf debris, and she'd handed him a cup of coffee and he'd drunk it standing in the cold, and neither of them had made it into more than it was. Fenwick had stopped making comments. The absence of comments from Fenwick was more expressive than the comments had been. Cole had asked awkwardly and directly over breakfast one morning whether Caleb was going to be around more permanently, and Eliza had said she thought so. And Cole had nodded like this resolved something he'd been calculating for a while and gone back to his eggs. What hadn't been resolved, heading into December, was the matter of Dorothy Sims. Dorothy had been quiet since Franklin's visit, visibly, ostentatiously quiet. The kind of quiet that in a small town functions as its own kind of noise. She attended the same church socials she always attended, visited the same families she always visited, walked the same routes through town, but she'd stopped speaking to Eliza directly, and she'd stopped speaking to the people she knew were connected to Eliza, which in practice meant she'd stopped speaking to about a third of the useful relationships in Bell's Mill. In a town that size, choosing your silences was a social strategy, and Dorothy's silence was saying something. Eliza let it say it. She didn't have the energy to manage Dorothy's feelings about having lost, and she'd made a decision early in the situation not to spend herself on things she couldn't affect. But Dorothy wasn't the only one watching. The people who had supported Eliza through the dispute, the mill workers, Fenwick's contacts, the Hadley supplier, the doctor's wife, had watched the outcome with the particular attention of people who had put something small on the line and seen it pay off. Not money, not anything tangible. Something more like credibility. They'd said they would stand with her if it came to it, and it hadn't come to it, but they'd been willing, and that willingness had meant something. She understood, slowly, that the dispute had done something beyond resolving her own situation. It had revealed a network, people in Bell's Mill who had a stake in the same things she had a stake in, who understood that the town's livability depended on things like a functioning boarding house, a mill that ran honestly, a community that didn't simply allow men like Franklin Sims to extract value from it without accountability. That network had always existed, it just hadn't had a reason to know itself. She talked to Caleb about it on a Wednesday evening, the first Wednesday in December, their usual walk, the cold requiring both of them to keep moving rather than stand in one place talking. The doctor's wife came by again, she said. She wants to formalize the recovery room arrangement. She's been talking to 2 other families about whether there's interest in some kind of organized relationship between the boarding house and the medical practice. Caleb was quiet for a moment, thinking, what kind of organized relationship? I don't know yet. Something that gives patients a guaranteed rate and a designated room during recovery? Maybe some kind of basic care arrangement, not nursing, I'm not trained for that, but meals, clean space, someone present. She'd been turning this over for days. It's more than I've been doing, but the 15-year lease means I have time to build into something more. What do you want it to be? She looked at the road ahead. Something that belongs here. That's part of how this town works. Not just a place to sleep. She paused. The mill brings workers in from out of county. Some of them have families. Some of them get hurt or sick. There's nowhere adequate for any of that right now. He was quiet long enough that she glanced at him. He was looking ahead with the focused expression he had when he was building something in his mind. What? She said. The mills had conversations about worker housing, he said, off and on for 3 years. We haven't done anything with it because there's no space on the mill property, and building something new is... He shook his head. It's expensive and complicated, and nobody's made it a priority because the workers who need it most don't have voices in those conversations. They stay at the boarding house, she said. Some of them. The ones who can afford it. The ones who can't sleep in the bunk room at the mill, which is... It's not adequate. It's cold and it's crowded, and 2 men got sick there last January that I think would have done better somewhere else. She stopped walking. He stopped too. If the boarding house expands, she said carefully, if I take on the room next to 4, it's just storage right now, and the doctor's wife arrangement formalizes. I could make a case to the mill's owners for a subsidy, Caleb said. Not charity, a business arrangement. The mill pays a fixed monthly rate for guaranteed access to boarding house rooms for workers in need. It costs them less than building their own facility, and it's better for the workers. She looked at him. You've thought about this before. Not in those terms, but I've been thinking about the bunk room problem for a year. He met her eyes. You're describing a solution. She stood on the frozen street in the December dark and felt something she didn't always feel, the specific weight of something that was bigger than she'd planned for, that had started as one thing and was becoming something else, and she wasn't frightened by it. She was interested. "Let me talk to the doctor's wife first," she said. "Get that arrangement on paper. Then we bring the mill conversation." "Yes," he said, "one thing at a time." "But you think it's possible?" "I think it's possible," he said. "The mill owners are practical men. If I show them the numbers, they'll see it." She started walking again. He kept pace. "You said you'd make a case to them," she said. "Yes." "You'd put your name on it." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "That's not a small thing. If they don't go for it, you've spent political capital." "I know." He didn't slow down. "Some things are worth spending it on." She didn't answer that directly, but she reached out and put her hand in the crook of his arm, the way a person does on an icy road when the footing is uncertain. Except the road wasn't particularly icy right there, and they both knew it, and he put his other hand briefly over hers without breaking stride or commenting on it, and they walked the rest of the way to the boarding house like that, in the cold December dark, saying nothing else that needed to be said. The conversation with the doctor's wife, her name was Harriet Soames, and Eliza had been calling her the doctor's wife for so long she had to consciously correct herself, happened 2 days later in the boarding house dining room over tea, with a piece of paper between them and both women's handwriting adding to it as the conversation developed. Harriet Soames was 53, small and precise, and entirely without sentimentality, which Eliza found refreshing. She didn't talk around things. "I want 4 rooms designated," Harriet said, "available on 48 hours' notice. 2 for recovery patients, 1 for families traveling with a patient, 1 flexible. Monthly rate, not per night. It's more predictable." "I can do 3 designated rooms," Eliza said. 4 strains my capacity for regular boarders, and I can't carry the house on your contract alone." Harriet considered. 3. But I want first right on room 4 specifically. It's quietest." "Room 4 it is," Eliza wrote it down. "Meals included in the rate?" "Breakfast and dinner. Lunch is too variable for patients." "Agreed." She wrote that too. "And I need something in writing from your husband about the medical protocol. I'm not a nurse and I won't pretend to be, but I need to know what he expects from the care environment." Harriet looked at her over the teacup. "He'll think you're overstepping." "He can think whatever he likes. I need the protocol in writing." A pause. Then Harriet smiled, small, genuine. "I'll get you the protocol." They shook hands over the paper. It wasn't a formal contract. They'd have Marsh formalize the language, but it was an understanding between 2 practical women, which in Eliza's experience was often more reliable than the formal version. After Harriet left, Eliza sat with the paper and the tea and allowed herself briefly to see the shape of what was building. Not triumphantly, she wasn't built for triumph exactly, didn't trust it as a stable state, but steadily. The boarding house had been, for 2 years, a place she ran to survive. Now it was becoming something she was building by choice, which was a different thing entirely, and the difference mattered more than she'd expected. The week before Christmas, Caleb presented the mill arrangement to the 2 men who owned the property, brothers named Aldous, who had inherited the mill from their father, and ran it with the particular combination of shrewdness and risk aversion common to people who have been handed something valuable and are primarily worried about losing it. Caleb came to the boarding house afterward and sat down at the kitchen table and said nothing for a moment. "That bad?" Eliza asked. "No." He looked up. "They said yes." She blinked. "They said yes immediately?" "After 40 minutes of questions, but yes." Something in his face that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to satisfaction. The older one, Edward, said it was the first proposal he'd seen that addressed the bunkroom problem without requiring him to spend capital on construction. The younger one asked 3 times whether the arrangement could be terminated on short notice if they decided it wasn't working. "What did you say?" "I said the lease runs 15 years, and any mill arrangement would be a sublease. So no, it couldn't be terminated casually." He didn't like that. Caleb paused. Then I told him that casual termination was exactly the kind of thing that had made the bunkroom situation as bad as it was. Nobody committed to it, nobody accountable for it. And if he wanted to keep losing workers to illness every January, casual termination was an excellent approach. She stared at him. "You said that to the man who owns the mill." He wasn't wrong to ask. Caleb said, but he needed to hear the answer. She looked at him for a long moment. Are you going to have a problem there now? Edward Aldous liked the proposal, Caleb said. Edward runs the mill, his brother runs the accounts. As long as the numbers work, which they do, his brother's feelings about the conversation don't matter much. She let out a breath. All right, he agreed. Now we need to work out the actual numbers. They worked out the numbers at the kitchen table that evening, Eliza with her ledger and Caleb with the mill's labor records he'd brought rolled under his arm. And it was the kind of work that was dense and unglamorous, and that they were both, it turned out, good at in compatible ways. She was faster on the accounting side. He was more precise about the mill's scheduling constraints. And between them, they built something on paper that was workable, which is the most you can honestly say about any plan at its beginning. Cole came into the kitchen partway through, took in the scene, papers everywhere, both of them with pencils, talking in the shorthand of people who had been working together for a while, and quietly made himself useful by putting the kettle on, and then retreating without being asked. Eliza noticed, and did not remark on it. The formal documents for both arrangements, the Soames medical contract and the Aldous mill arrangement, were drafted by Marsh in January and signed before the month was out. By that point, December had done its worst. The river had frozen for 3 weeks and thawed badly. And 2 mill workers who had previously spent those weeks in the bunk room had instead stayed in rooms 2 and 3 of the boarding house, where it was warm and they had hot meals and nobody got the lung sickness that had taken one man out of commission for 6 weeks the previous year. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. Word spread the way things spread in a mill town, not through announcements, but through the specific network of men who worked together and talked over the things that affected their lives. By February, Eliza had a waiting list. Not a long one. She didn't have unlimited rooms. But a list, which was something she had never had before. Workers from out of county who were coming to Bell's Mill in the spring and had been told by someone who knew someone that the Harper boarding house was where you wanted to be. She managed this with the same deliberateness she managed everything, one decision at a time, not expanding faster than she could maintain quality, not taking on more than the house could hold. She turned down 2 requests that would have stretched things too thin, and she was not comfortable doing it. She didn't like turning people away, but she'd learned enough in the past 2 years to know that overstretching was how you ended up losing what you'd built. The spring brought other changes. Cole left in March. Not badly, not dramatically, just the natural end of a temporary stay. He packed his traveling case and shook Eliza's hand and shook Caleb's hand. Caleb had been at the boarding house that morning for no particular reason, which had stopped being unusual, and said he thought he'd head south after all. He looked more settled than he'd looked when he arrived, she thought. More like someone who knew what he was doing, even if he didn't know exactly where he was going. Fenwick stayed. Fenwick was, she had come to understand, a permanent feature, not because he couldn't afford to go somewhere else, or had nowhere to go, but because the boarding house had become his home in the real sense, the place where his life was organized, and he was 71 years old and had stopped seeing the need to be anywhere that wasn't already home. She had stopped seeing him as a boarder and started seeing him as something closer to family, which she suspected he knew and was not going to make the mistake of saying out loud. What happened between her and Caleb in those months was not dramatic. It did not have the sweeping quality of the stories she'd heard as a girl, the ones where love arrived like weather and rearranged everything at once. What it had was consistency. He was there. Not every moment, not hovering, not abandoning his own work and his own life. He still ran the mill with the focused attention he'd always given it, still came home to his cabin west of town, still kept his own rhythms. But the rhythms overlapped with hers in the way that 2 rivers overlap when they run close to each other. Not the same river, but near enough that the water knows the difference. She cooked in his kitchen twice in February, staying late enough that walking back across town in the cold made less sense than staying, which required practical acknowledgement of a situation that had been practical for a while. He kept a hook by the door for her coat. She did not point out that this was what he'd done in her house, or that it meant something. Some things mean more when they're left to mean it quietly. In April, on an evening that was finally warm enough that they could sit on the cabin's south-facing porch without their coats, she said, "I think we should get married." He looked at her. She looked at the road. That's not... She stopped. I'm not asking because it's the done thing. I'm asking because I've been thinking about it, and I think it's what I want, and I'd rather say it directly than wait for the right moment, because I've been waiting for the right moment my entire adult life, and it's a habit that hasn't served me well. He was quiet. If you need time to... No, he said. No, you don't need time, or no, you don't. Yes, he said. I want to marry you. She looked at him. He looked back. He was not a man who decorated things. All right, she said. All right, he said. They sat on the porch in the April warmth, and the quiet between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't need filling, and she thought about something Fenwick had said to her once, that the most important things in a life don't usually arrive with much ceremony, that you spend years waiting for the important thing to show up, making noise, and then you look back and see it had been the quiet moments all along. She thought he was being sentimental when he said it. She hadn't been a person who trusted sentiment. She was revising that opinion. They married in May at the county courthouse in Hadley, with Fenwick and Harriet Soames and Edmund Marsh as witnesses, which was exactly enough people and no more. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Eliza wore the good dress she'd bought in November with the first month's income after the lease was signed, and Caleb wore his best coat and had done something different with his hair that she didn't mention except to think, privately, that it suited him. Marsh took them all to supper afterward at the Hadley Inn, which was a considerably better establishment than the Bell's Mill Lantern, and Fenwick ate with the focused happiness of a man whose investment in the outcome had been fully vindicated, and who was not above letting everyone at the table know it, obliquely, through the sustained good humor of his conversation. She did not feel like a different person. This was the thing she hadn't been expecting. She'd assumed marriage would feel like a transformation, a before and after, the way the lease signing had felt like a before and after. Instead, it felt like a confirmation, like something that had already been true had now been said out loud where it could be counted. Caleb said, on the ride back to Bell's Mill in the early evening, "You're quiet. I'm thinking." "About what?" "About how I thought this would feel different than it does." He considered that. Different how? More... She searched for it. More like something had changed, but it doesn't feel like something changed. It feels like something finished. He was quiet for a moment. "Is that bad?" "No," she said. "It's good. I think it's exactly right." She looked out the buggy window at the road. "I spent 2 years in Bell's Mill trying to make things stable enough that I could stop bracing for everything to fall apart. And I did make them stable, mostly. And then I spent a few more months not trusting the stability." She paused. "This feels like trusting it. For the first time." He didn't say anything, but she felt him shift beside her, a small settling, and she understood that he was doing the same thing in his own way, trusting something, letting himself have it. Bell's Mill received the news with the unsurprised equanimity of a town that had seen the whole thing coming for much longer than the two people involved had. The doctor, at Harriet's prompting, shook Caleb's hand outside the mill and told him he'd made a sensible choice, which was the highest form of medical compliment available in Bell's Mill. 2 of the regular mill workers stopped Eliza on the street and offered congratulations in the awkward, genuine way of men who aren't sure what to say, but mean it. The Hadley supplier, on his next visit, brought a small crate of goods he'd been saving and left it at the front desk with a note that said simply, "For the household." Dorothy Sims, walking past the boarding house on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the wedding, paused at the door and looked in through the window for a moment. Eliza was at the front desk. Their eyes met through the glass. Dorothy walked on. It wasn't forgiveness. Eliza wasn't sure forgiveness was the right word for it, or that it was what either of them wanted. It was something more like acknowledgement, like 2 people agreeing without saying anything, that the situation had resolved, and they both knew it, and neither needed to prove anything further. That was enough. Not everything needs to be more than enough. The thing Eliza came to understand in the 1.5 years after the lease signing and the mill arrangement and the marriage and the boarding house's slow becoming something more was something she could not have understood before she'd lived it. She had spent her adult life believing that security was something you built by yourself or not at all. That depending on other people meant handing them a piece of something they could take from you later. She had come to Bell's Mill alone, built everything alone, defended everything alone, And she had been proud of that because it was the only thing available to be proud of. She hadn't been wrong, exactly. She had needed to be the person who built it. Nobody else was going to do it for her, and she'd known that, and she'd done it. That part was real. But she'd been wrong about what the building was for. She'd thought it was to make herself safe, and it had done that. But somewhere in the months of fighting for the boarding house and watching Caleb stand beside her without being asked, and watching Fenwick provide his notarized stamp, and watching the doctor's wife bring her pickled vegetables, and watching Cole fill the wood box. Somewhere in all of that, she'd started to understand that the building wasn't just for her safety. It was the foundation of something larger, a place where people brought their need and found it met, a place that gave workers somewhere decent to recover, a place that was going to outlast the dispute and the 30-day notice and Dorothy's gloves and everything that had tried to undo it. She hadn't built it to be a symbol. She'd built it to survive. But surviving, done consistently and honestly, and with enough care for the people in your immediate orbit, has a way of becoming something people can point to. Something that says, this is possible. This is what staying looks like. That was the thing she hadn't known when she came to Bell's Mill with $43 in her boot and a letter that had turned to nothing in her hands. You don't build for legacy. You don't aim at meaning. You just stay and work and pay attention and let people help you when they offer and help them back when you can. And one day you look up and what you've built is bigger than you. On a Wednesday evening in late October, nearly 3 years after the first Wednesday, Caleb had walked her home. She was standing at the boarding house door watching him come up Merchant Street from the mill. Same jacket, same unhurried walk, clipboard under his arm. He looked up and saw her in the doorway and lifted his chin in the small acknowledgement he'd been making for 3 years, and she thought, that is a man who has been walking toward me for a long time. And she was a woman who had learned, finally, to stand in the doorway and wait for him. He came up the porch steps. Good day, he said. The Hadley supplier is increasing the firewood rate by 12% next month. That's going to be a problem. I know. I already wrote to his competitor in Tanner Creek. She stepped back to let him in. Supper's on. He hung his coat on his hook and his scarf on top of it, and she went back to the kitchen and he followed, and behind them the boarding house went about its evening. Fenwick in his chair, the sound of a boarder moving around upstairs, the stove doing its complicated work, the familiar smell of a place that was lived in and tended and real. Some roads take longer than they should. Some people circle what they want for years before they let themselves have it. Some of the most important decisions a person makes don't look like decisions at the time. They look like just another Wednesday evening, just another walk in the same direction as someone you trust. But that's how most of the real things happen, not in a moment. In the accumulation of ordinary days, chosen and kept, one after another, until the road you've been walking together becomes the only road you remember.